I'm LaShawn Jefferson, the Deputy Director of Perry House, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Affairs think tank. I hope everyone is keeping safe during these tumultuous and trying times. Thanks for joining us for our signature program, The World Today, a weekly one-hour conversation where we explore a critical global affairs issue. I'll do my formal introduction to our guest of honor, Ambassador Kelley Currie, in a moment, but before then, a few logistical notes. Your questions are essential to the effectiveness of our programming, and you'll have an opportunity to ask them following the conversation between Ambassador Currie and me. In order to pose a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface, right there in the middle of the screen. Let's save the chat function for any technical and other logistical issues and to feature resources during the conversation. However, if for some reason you cannot see or use the Q&A function, please pose your questions within the chat function. Finally, let's keep the content in the chat and the Q&A functions appropriate for the professional discussion we're having. Thank you for joining us for this edition of The World Today, a program of Perry House, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Affairs Center. Today, we have the good fortune of speaking with Kelley Currie, the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues. COVID-19 has affected the daily lives of nearly every person in the world. However, these effects have been specific, enduring, and sometimes less visible and less well understood consequences for women. Ambassador Kelley Currie will highlight how her office works to address the issues at the heart of the gendered effects of COVID-19 and to make sure that what is happening to women is seen, understood, and in fact remedied. Ambassador Currie was appointed Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues in December of 2019. She also concurrently serves as the U.S. representative at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. In these two roles, she leads the implementation of the 2020 U.S. Strategy on Women, Peace, and Security to identify and support women leaders around the world who contribute to global security. Throughout her career in foreign policy, Ambassador Currie has specialized in human rights, political reform, and development and humanitarian issues with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region. She's worked across policy environments with the Department of State, U.S. Congress, and international and non-governmental human rights and humanitarian organizations. Prior to her appointment as Ambassador at Large, she led the Department of State's Office of Global Criminal Justice and served as the United States representative to the UN Economic and Social Council. Ambassador Currie, thanks so much for joining us today. Let's turn to you for your introductory thoughts.
Thank you so much, LaShawn. It's such a great pleasure to be here today with Perry House, and I'd like to thank you all for making this event possible and for being able to talk about an issue that's really close to my own heart, which is the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and how this intersects with the current pandemic and crisis that we're facing. It's one of our top priorities here and something that I do care about quite a bit. It's as the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, as the introduction said, my office does work to promote the rights and empowerment of women and girls through U.S. foreign policy. And the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, together with our Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, are the two pillars that we use to implement this goal. These priorities demonstrate our commitment to the empowerment and full participation of women in every aspect of society. We know that that societies that empower women are more stable, prosperous, and peaceful. And so we are working across our foreign policy to implement these two big agenda items and help support a successful policy and foreign policy and national security implementation. 20 years ago this month, actually, the UN Security Council passed UNSCR Resolution 1325, which enshrined the Women, Peace, and Security agenda into the Security Council's permanent tableau of efforts that they work across. And as the United States has led this effort since 2000, and even before the passage of UNSCR 1325, and we continue to lead in the effort to implement this important international effort. In 2017, for instance, the United States, thanks to a broad bipartisan effort, became the first country and still the only country in the world to have national level legislation that enshrines the Women, Peace, and Security agenda into our law. And we use this tool, the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017, to continue to advance our leadership. This has manifested in efforts such as the 2019 Women, Peace, and Security National Strategy that the White House produced, and or 2018's National Strategy. And then this year, we have produced a implementation plan for our agency to continue to build upon our 2 decades of efforts on this agenda. And when we issued our implementation plan this summer, we issued it alongside the Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, and USAID, our Agency for International Development, demonstrating, and we work very closely with the National Security Council on this interagency effort to make sure that all of the relevant agencies that work across our national security and foreign policy infrastructure are engaged in advancing this agenda. We at the Department of State are uniquely positioned to advance this agenda and to reinforce America's global leadership on women, peace, and security in 4 key areas. We work on policy, diplomacy, partnerships, and innovative programs. Through our global presence, we have a distinct comparative advantage to engage partners on the ground. We work through 300 embassies, consulates, and diplomatic missions around the world, and tens of thousands of personnel deployed overseas, as well as here in Washington and in New York through our UN agency, our UN presence, as well as in Geneva. Currently, we're working with more than 30 countries directly, in conjunction with more than 10 regional and international organizations to carry out this effort. And this doesn't even include the peacekeeping training, the whole effort that our Department of Defense is doing through the combatant commands, and all of the work that USAID is doing. This is just what the State Department itself is doing. So as you can see, the United States remains a global leader in preventing and responding to violence against women and girls, especially in conflict and crisis affected areas and fragile states. This is a human rights imperative for us, and addressing these threats helps us to foster greater civic leadership for women, helps us to get ahead of preventing violent extremism, and it helps to foster economic prosperity. We see these things as all interlinked and cross-cutting. What has also become very clear since the beginning of the COVID pandemic is how important these agenda items are to address what we see as the disproportionate impact on women as a result of the pandemic. We especially see this in women and girls who are experiencing spikes in gender-based violence, or who've lost their economic opportunities or schooling. Their livelihoods are often the first to go in an economic downturn. And we certainly seen that here, as women make up a majority of workers in informal sectors and in service sectors that have been deeply affected by the economic crisis. And then we also see it in the increased care and household unpaid care burdens and unpaid household work burdens that women and girls have had to shoulder since the beginning of the pandemic. We also see it with the public health measures that were necessary to stop the spread of the disease by placing women in stay-at-home orders and lockdowns that left women in vulnerable positions at home with abusers or unable to access vital services. So we have noticed that this is as part of our unprecedented humanitarian all of America response to the pandemic. We've been working directly with organizations at the local level that are seeking to support women and girls who are at greater risk of violence as a result of the pandemic, who are at greater risk of losing their livelihoods as a result of it, and who are facing other grave risks, including, as I have mentioned before, in fragile and conflict-affected states. So we're doing a lot of monitoring of data and reporting to inform our prevention and response efforts on gender-based violence and violence against women. And I've personally been working with our posts overseas and around the world to ensure that our programs are able to be increased and maintained at pre-pandemic levels. A lot of what we've seen is that as countries, including wealthy donor countries in the West, have had to reallocate resources to respond to the public health crisis or to their economic crisis at home. They've cut overseas assistance. They've cut programs such as the ones that we are providing additional support to. And so these interventions on our part have become even more critical during this time. And I'm really proud to say that to date, the United States State Department and our Agency for International Development have announced more than $1.3 billion in additional health, humanitarian, and economic assistance for women and girls that prioritizes those in the greatest needs. However, we really have fought hard to make sure that women are not seen solely through a victim lens. We don't see that as an appropriate or even very helpful narrative to have out there. While women certainly are in need of greater services and assistance, we want to make sure that we continue to focus on how women are serving on the front lines of this pandemic response, treating medical patients, raising awareness about prevention, and working in their communities to help strengthen their community's response and resilience. And we've also seen women in our economic programs shifting their whole business model to produce PPE and to get meals out to people who are unable to travel out of their homes. So we've been really, we're really focused on how we can help women as drivers of the response and the recovery efforts. That's a really critical element of what we're doing, and how we conceptualize and then carry out our work here is seeing, giving women that agency, emphasizing their agency as actors here, and helping to support them as they move out across their communities. And we're working really with our international partners to help get them to focus on this effort too, and to get them to be able to support women's full and meaningful contributions across all spheres of society, including being at the table for the highest levels of discussion around recovery and response, and making sure that the policies that are coming out of this crisis address the needs that have been highlighted and the challenges that have been highlighted through the pandemic. We're really focused, like I said, on resilience and on being flexible to help make sure that as we're doing all of these things, that we're keeping an eye on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Because at the end of the day, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is really about making sure that women are at those critical tables where decisions are being made about their lives, about their families, and about their communities, and that their voices are heard. So we see the Women, Peace, and Security agenda as a very, very critical piece of our COVID-19 response. And we've been really focused on countries such as Afghanistan, where we're working with the special representative of the United States, who's engaged in the intra-Afghan dialogues and helping negotiations to help make sure that women's voices are heard in the peace process there, that the women who are participating in the negotiations have all the skills and training that they need, and that the women's civil society organizations that are observing and acting outside of the negotiations are able to fully participate, make their voices heard, and that even in some ways, more importantly, that the men at the table, especially those representing the Afghan government, are doing their part to advocate for the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan and secure and protect those rights. Because it's not enough for the women to advocate for those things, but it's really critically important that the entire Afghan government negotiating team do that. And so far, that's been one of the really bright spots that we've seen, as we have seen tremendous leadership from the whole negotiating team. That has allowed and that they've given the women on the team an opportunity to shine and to really speak out very clearly, and that they've backed them up. And that's been really, really important. It's been amazing to see how the women of Afghanistan have really come to the fore and are leading this discussion. We are in a supporting role, which is appropriate and makes a lot of, that's the way this has to be seen. We think it's very important that, for instance, these ideas around women's rights and women's full participation in society are not seen as Western ideas, but that they are seen as fully consistent with Afghan society and with Afghan culture, which we believe they are, and which if you talk to any of these incredible Afghan women we work with, they will tell you these certainly are fully consistent, and that they are willing to fight to maintain their continued full participation in Afghan society. We also have been working with a lot of our, we do an annual competition, well, not really competition, an awards program in our office called the International Women of Courage Awards. And each year we honor between 10 and 12 women from around the world who have made extraordinary contributions or who have done extraordinary things. And this year we had a really incredible group of 12 women, and we've been working with them as they've been, we honored them right as the pandemic was starting to gather steam in early March, and then had to rush them back home as travel was shutting down. And so it's been a very interesting year working with them as they've almost all pivoted their projects that they work on as a result of this award to focusing on COVID and being responsive to the needs in their community. And so we've been really, it's been great to be able to work with them and see how they've adapted in real time to this crisis. I think that we're seeing them not only do things in their own community, but using their time as wisely as possible. For instance, one of our recipients used her lockdown time to take an international law course that would help her defend her rights in Malaysia and protect religious freedom in Malaysia. And one of our another one has written, a couple actually have written books during the lockdown. I mean, they're not letting any grass grow under their feet. And then our Pakistani award recipient was delivering hundreds of meals in her community and used her grant money to help support her community during the COVID crisis. So we're really seeing what we see through these individuals, how women are taking these leadership roles and how they are critical to the resilience of their communities and their countries and dealing with this unprecedented crisis. We're also really committed to holding accountable those who have committed human rights violations and who are, we're not letting this time take away from the fact that we have a larger responsibility to maintain a commitment to accountability and to calling out those who are threatening the rights of women. And I noticed as we were waiting to go online that you have a upcoming session on China titled, "Will China Save the World?" I can give you the answer to that one. The answer is no. And I can tell you that one of the reasons is something that we're very much focused on here in our office, which is looking at how the Chinese Communist Party's abuse of women especially in places like Xinjiang and Tibet, and what we're seeing there, whether it's the mass detention, the kind of intrusive regulations that regulate every facet of life, the heavy surveillance, the forced sterilization and forced abortion that we're seeing to coerce population control in Xinjiang, all of these things where we are just seeing tremendously negative impacts on women and girls in that society and among the Uyghur Muslims and other ethnic Muslims in the west of China, as well as in places like Tibet, where we're seeing major crackdowns on everybody's right to religious practice and on other aspects of culture and cultural preservation that are being threatened right now. So we're very concerned about some of these activities, and we've been doing a lot working with other bureaus and offices to highlight those efforts as well. And we really are trying to work with other countries, and we've seen some real progress recently. Just last week, in fact, at the United Nations. We saw 39 countries come together to talk about the crisis in Xinjiang, as well as the deprivation of freedom and rights in Hong Kong. And this is really, it's been a really long time since we've seen countries join together at this level, with this number of countries from around the world speaking out about China's severe violations of human rights. So we're seeing a real change as other countries are coming to understand the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to the normative framework for human rights at the international level. And that's something that we've been really working very hard on and have been an important part of. So while we're supporting women's economic and political empowerment globally for the past 2 decades, we do see that we have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And COVID, like I said, has in many ways highlighted some of the biggest gaps, and especially in the economic space, but also in the space of women's full participation in leadership and meaningful participation. We were just a couple of weeks ago, we had the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and the Beijing World Conference on Women, which took place in Beijing in 1995. And it was very interesting for us to watch the session. And even then, on a conference that was dedicated to the rights and empowerment of women, most of I think the first 50 leaders who spoke, there were so many male leaders speaking, and it was a lot. And we were honored to have our Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, deliver our statement. But it was really disheartening in many ways to see that still so few women presidents and heads of state were present to speak. So we still have a long way to go for sure, but we are continuing to work with our partners at the local level to build up capacity to help support women and girls around the world, and to help create those opportunities for them to thrive and be the leaders of tomorrow. So thank you so much again for this opportunity. I look forward to having a chance to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Currie, for those wonderful remarks. And we're going to start off with a couple of questions, and then we'll turn to what is an assortment of questions in the Q&A. So I wanted to start actually in a more of a general way with your office and the orientation during this period of a pandemic. And very particularly, we now live in a world where something like 37.5 million people are infected with the virus, with COVID. 1 million people have died worldwide. Economies have declined. Schooling has been disrupted. Violence is on the increase in various ways. Our entire way of being has been disrupted and potentially transformed because of the pandemic. I'm wondering then, given this kind of catastrophe at the global level, how your office manages then with your colleagues across the State Department and the world to recenter women's rights, as you've said in your remarks, as a part of a solution that's competing with lots of demands internationally now in terms of the pandemic. So what your office is doing in terms of orienting the rest of State Department to follow your lead, and allies from across the world to see women, as you've said in your remarks, as drivers of change, as parts of solution, not as kind of an additional burden, but the orientation or the reorientation that you've had to orchestrate from your own office and from your own leadership position.
That's a great question. And it's actually something that I will acknowledge that in March and April, we did struggle a little bit to figure out, okay, what is it that we should be focused on, and how should we be doing this in response to this challenge? Because, March is the month where we typically celebrate International Women's Day, and we had our Women of Courage Award ceremony and our big event here. But then the next thing that we should have been doing the following week was the Commission on the Status of Women, where I usually had our delegation. And the UN shut down that week. And so it was like, okay, this is real, this is really happening, and this is serious, and we've got to adapt. And so we took a couple weeks to kind of look at our priorities, which are women's economic empowerment and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and determine, is this really where we need to be focused? Are there other things we should be working on? And because I think that because we were really fortunate in a way, because we had two very clearly articulated priorities that nested very well within the need to respond to this crisis. Because as it became very apparent very quickly that women were being disproportionately impacted by the whether it was the lockdowns or the demands placed on public health systems or just the general economic collapse that resulted as because of the lockdowns and everybody shutting their economy down, shutting down travel, shutting down marketplaces. And so we were, like I said, very fortunate that we already had very well-established priorities that were well aligned to respond to the crisis as it emerged. And so we, with our Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, for example, WGDP, the way that we were already engaging with this program that was intended to economically empower 50 million women across the developing world by the year 2025. The program interventions were very well suited with some minor tweaking and a little bit of refocusing to attack the problem set in front of us. And so we sat down with our interagency group. There are 10 US government agencies and departments that work on WGDP. And we were able to quickly pull together our group of key agencies, make sure that we had the flexibility built into them to be able to pivot as needed, that our partners on the ground were able to adapt, and that we were able to continue to provide the support that they needed throughout the pandemic response. And that worked really, really well. I think that part of it is, when you have well-designed interventions that they're already working in these areas, when a crisis like this hits, it's a good test to see if they are well designed and if they are working properly. And we found that ours were, and so that was a relief in many ways. And so we were able to get additional funding. We were able to make arguments within our policy processes that, hey, this is an area where spending a little bit more money on these things will go a long way toward building resilience in our partners around the world. And because it was also very clear that international organizations were also focusing on the particular needs of women and girls in response to the crisis, that we were well positioned to engage in the advocacy work that our office does, as well as the programmatic and policy work that we do, whether it's on the global ceasefire initiative that the Secretary General of the UN initiated and how that aligned with our Women, Peace, and Security agenda, or whether it was the economic response to COVID and how that aligned with our Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. And then we have these cross-cutting initiatives on violence against women, where we were able to very quickly push out additional resources to local partners who already had well-established networks on the ground to address the particular challenges of women and girls who were at risk, a greater increased risk of violence due to lockdowns and economic hardship. So again, part of it is that we were already operating from a strong platform, and I have such a great team who was able to flex really quickly into the space that opened up for us.
You do have a great team, and I want to follow up on you've embedded in that response at least 7 potential follow-up questions, but we're here today in part to turn to audience questions, but if you will indulge me for maybe 1 or 2 more. I mean, your office has, previous to you with your predecessors, has been very committed to economic rights for women. And your office has been a major proponent of advocating for women's rights in the economic sphere as a part of a broader commitment to obviously women's human rights, but also to peace and security issues. Obviously, during the pandemic, women have suffered, if not disproportionately, certainly very acutely on the economic front. And in many places, middle and upper income countries, you might have relief programs that would support many women who've either lost jobs to regain them, or encouraging women to keep their jobs and trying to kind of come to some semblance of balance between, the elusive home and work. But what I'm curious about is that, as you know, many women in the developing world and lower income countries are in fact in the informal sector. And so a lot of programs that were meant to help women and help business owners in general might not reach women who are in the informal sector, don't own businesses in their own name, or are in very low wage work. And I'm curious about what your office has been seeing and doing in terms of rectifying the economic consequences of this pandemic on women around the world, and particularly those in middle income and low income developing countries.
So this is where, again, our WGDP program has been so incredibly well suited to the moment. The three pillars of that program revolve around helping reskill and right skill women to be able to take advantage of the jobs that are out there and exist, and that's everything from STEM and training in non-traditional fields to just addressing issues around digital divide. So obviously that's critical in the current environment. The second pillar is about entrepreneurship, and that is really, again, could not be better suited to the current environment. When you talk about women in the informal economy, you're talking about women who are proto-entrepreneurs largely. And what they often need is they need things like access to capital, or they need training on how to do a business plan and how to go apply for a loan and how to get access to markets and how to be able to scale their business, and what they need to do to get it registered so that it's not an informal business but moves into the formal sector. So those were already pieces of what we were doing through our entrepreneurship pillar with WGDP. And then the third pillar is on the enabling environment for women, and again, could not be better suited for what we're dealing with now. We had found in February that in just 5 areas of law, if countries around the world eliminated restrictions on these 5 areas of law, that it could create $7.7 trillion in additional global GDP. And that's trillion with a T. And so when we would tell people this, finance ministers and others and business people, that got their attention. Coming back from this pandemic, obviously, the ability to create and unlock additional economic growth, get women off the sidelines and back into the economy is going to be critical. Not just to, it's not just a nice to have thing. It is literally going to be the difference between the survival of your economy and not. And countries increasingly have seen that over the past 9 months. I mean, if there is a silver lining to any of this, it's the recognition that countries across all income levels are having about the importance of making sure that their enabling environment supports women's full economic participation, and how critical that is to the prosperity and stability of their country and the resilience of their economies. So you actually are seeing, we can't keep up with the demand from partners around the world who want to participate in the WGDP program in across the different pillars of it. And we're working with so many, I mean, I literally can't keep up with it. And we could do double what we're doing based on the demand we're seeing right now and still have room for growth. It's been incredible how, I mean, again, this is what I can't always remember the right things, but genius is when inspiration meets preparation, and we were fortunately very well prepared for this disaster in that we had this program we had been building for the past couple years, and when this tsunami hit, we were able to move forward into the space that was created, and we continue to, and we're continuing to refine it and move it forward. But being able, and it's not a lot of money either. That's what's so amazing, is that it's, we're talking globally trillions of dollars that are being poured into response efforts, our piece of it is in, hundreds of millions, which is a lot of money. If I'm not saying that it's not a lot of money, but at scale, it's still the ability to impact with the amount of money that we're spending has been tremendous. And we're really seeing the results from, from all around the world with the entrepreneurs that we're working with who are able to survive this and thrive in this environment because of the skills that they've learned through the work, the programming, through the access to capital that they're able to get, and through their ability to advocate with their governments to make sure that their responses to the crisis are gender sensitive and take into account the need to empower women to fully participate.
We've got lots of excellent questions in the Q&A function, and I'm going to move to them with just one more for me. So, one of the things that I think we're discovering all over the world, including the US, is that women are not equally situated in their own countries. That in the US, you have instances, obviously, of ethnic and racial minorities being disproportionately affected by the pandemic of women. Similarly, in countries around the world, gender non-conforming women, women who make up parts of ethnic, religious, and racial minorities in their own countries have been hit harder and differently. And, those women are often invisible. I'm wondering, one, how your office ensures that the programs that the US government is funding reach gender non-conforming, LGBTQ, women, ethnic minority women in their own countries, and whether or not you have examples you can share with us of where you feel like there's been an impact in terms of reaching women who are often invisible in their own country and often, in fact, targeted for additional violence and exclusion in their own country.
Well, I think that I would really, USAID carries out a lot of the programming that reaches into some of these communities and has done a tremendous job with both their New Partner Initiative as well as with the WGDP Fund, which is intended to be a catalytic fund that is out there looking for these underserved and marginalized communities to help bring them off the sidelines and bring them into full participation. And I think that they do a really great job with this. They, especially through the New Partner Initiative, it's been really important for them to look beyond the usual, their usual partners and find those who can reach to these underserved communities. And with our office, we have a very small program budget, and so by necessity, we are always looking to fill in gaps and to fit into those areas where the other interventions are not necessarily working or not reaching. And so I will, with our Voices Against Violence initiative, for instance, we work directly with local organizations on the ground in countries to help make sure that women who are at risk from domestic violence or gender and sexual violence, sexual and gender-based violence, are being served and are getting the assistance they need. And we do that through partnerships with local organizations and with our partner, our great partners on that are Vital Voices and the Avon Foundation. And so we are really, we're able to get really in the grassroots there with that initiative. But I think also the other thing that we've seen is through some of the financing initiatives that we're doing, whether it's the big ones with the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank on financial inclusion for women, right down to the micro lending that we're doing in various countries, we are seeing that the demands are high, and we do need to continue to keep an eye on this. But we are also seeing that, for instance, with micro lending program, I was just reading through one of our program summaries about one of our micro lending programs where women's ability to repay their micro loans has fallen off a cliff. And so our micro lending programs are having to adapt and figure out how to recapitalize without the usual financial flows coming in, and how they can help, and having to go out to their clients and help them figure out how to adjust their businesses. And so, I mean, we look at our programs at the macro level for effectiveness, but we also are hearing the stories of our women that we work with. And for instance, we have a chocolate maker in Peru who is, trying to figure out how to keep her business open. And we're, in touch with her, but we're also working with the World Bank on a big new initiative to help provide technical assistance at the country level to change laws that make it more difficult for women to get access to credit or to be able to get identification papers or be able to inherit property on an equal basis. So it's this high-low mixed strategy, I think, that's working really well for us, in that we're able to, we have direct contact with beneficiaries on a day-to-day basis, but we're also working at this very high level with these big global institutions and trying to provide that connective tissue between the two.
And maybe to return to one theme that you mentioned and that's central to your office's work and your global diplomacy, which is obviously the issue of violence against women. Many countries have in fact reported that there have been some increased reporting, and certainly a general sense that in countries that have gone on lockdown, where women have had to perhaps spend more time with abusers, that incidents have gone up. I'm curious if you can elaborate a little more on what your office is seeing globally in terms of violence against women during the pandemic, and particularly since a lot of safety net programs are being challenged at this time. Women aren't able to leave home to seek shelter where this is possible outside of the home, are having, again, to spend more time with their abusers. Whether or not there are any special measures your office has begun to advocate for in light of the pandemic, and again, generally what you're seeing across the world. And that's a question from the Q&A function here.
Well, it's an area certainly that everybody that kind of works in this field is very sensitized to right now, because it has been, we were expecting a spike, and the numbers seem to be backing that up. And the challenge of getting access to services that are often provided through institutions that are no longer open or not available, whether it's churches or schools or other public services that are government offices that are no longer able to accept the kinds of walk-ins and things like that that are usually part of the package of how governments respond and how civil society responds to these challenges. What we've seen is a lot of innovation at the local level, a lot of effort to try to find solutions through these local organizations. Vital Voices and our Voices Against Violence partnership we've doubled the funding, I think, this year. Just since COVID, we pushed out an additional, almost doubling of their budget. And then we're continuing to work with other partners.
I'm sorry, Ambassador, you said you doubled the budget of, was it Vital Voices?
To the Voices Against Violence initiative, okay. Yes. We doubled our grant to them this year. With additional funds to help them increase their capacity and be able to respond in a more flexible way. And so far, we've seen a lot of innovation at the local level, and really, I think that's what it's going to take. Even here in the United States, we're struggling with this. I actually talked to my counterpart over at the Department of Justice and the Violence Against Women office over there, and I know that since the beginning of the pandemic that they've been really challenged to try to get their usual channels of assistance and programming and support to widen, to be able to deal with the challenges that they're facing. But we're finding ways, and the private sector has really been a tremendous source of support in places as far, as diverse as Kosovo to, Africa, to different Latin America, where we're seeing this. We're also working in the Pacific Islands with a number of partners to help them come up with innovative responses. We found, I was talking to our counterparts in Kosovo a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about how the private sector has been a tremendous help to them in terms of supporting supporting the victims of domestic violence and women who are facing challenges there. So that's been, we've got to throw everything we have at the problem. And so far, that's been the response. It's been, again, what's been really amazing to me is to see how at the height, from the highest level all the way down to the grassroots, there is so much, I think, awareness around the particular challenges that women are facing as a result of the pandemic. You've seen it in the news reporting around it, and you've seen it in policy responses. So it actually is a very positive response I see so far.
We have a lot of questions, and I'm going to try to group them together in the Q&A function that are really about the thing that I think has been getting a lot of press, apart from, violence and the economic downturn for women in particular. And that is this kind of now triple burden of women being disproportionately or differently affected by the pandemic, having caretaker responsibilities at home with school closing and jobs on the decline. And working. And so in some ways, the pandemic has laid bare gender norms that have changed somewhat over the course of decades, but certainly haven't changed dramatically for a lot of women in a lot of parts of the world. And from doing this work, and I know from doing this work a long time ago, that the hardest thing to change is actually gender norms in the home, where we're seeing lots of behavior that is landing or ensuring that women have, the greatest burden at home and outside of the home. And so I'm wondering what, again, your office is doing. And again, several questions in the chat focus on what can be done and what your office is doing to lead the way in terms of the transformation that has to happen in the home for women to get kind of unburdened with, or at least recognized and compensated for the unpaid work that they do, and really to change the gender norms, because it won't be enough to just compensate women for working 24 hours a day.
Well, that's certainly true. I think, I feel very fortunate because I'm blessed with a partner who has always taken on a fair share of the work at home, and with my, at home with my kids and with my household. So I do feel very fortunate in that respect. But I think that this crisis has really accelerated that conversation and around a lot of dining tables and a lot of households, and has changed it both, and also in a lot of boardrooms where companies have invested for decades and are now seeing women at senior levels and all, up and down the ladder, dropping out of the workforce because of the unpaid care burdens that they are having to take on and having to make very difficult and painful decisions. I think, each country and in some cases, we're going to see thousands of different solutions to this problem. And I think that's the way it should be. I don't think that there is a single silver bullet. I think that a lot of it is about, I think it has accelerated that conversation and brought it out into the open in a lot more meaningful ways. And that because we're anticipated to lose female workforce participation here in the United States at an alarming rate. I mean, if you look at before COVID, we had the highest level of female workforce participation that we've ever had in the history of this country. And what damage is going to be done by the crisis is already being predicted in the billions and potentially trillions of dollars to our economy, to lose the contributions of those women. And so you are seeing changes. I mean, I know that, for instance, just here in the State Department, we moved up the timeline for fully implementing paid family leave in order to address some of these things, and the U.S. government as a whole has done that for federal employees, and that we are continuing to look at at solutions. I mean, just here in our own office, it is probably behind it goes back and forth between the health concerns, the technology concerns, and the care concerns, and of those three, the care issue is the one that really keeps my workforce from being able to come in more so, I think, even than health and technology. So we continue to, we don't have obvious solutions here in the United States, and I think every country is struggling to figure this out, and every community is struggling to figure it out. And hopefully, though, the silver lining here is that by having a much more open and fruitful and real conversation about the costs of not doing anything and of not addressing these challenges, we'll start to come up with more and better solutions that can really help keep women able to fully participate in the workforce. And I think technology is going to be part of it. I think the new way of working is going to be part of it. But I think there's also got to be solutions that work up and down the economic spectrum and all across it, because the solutions that work for me and my family are going to be very different from the ones that work for, for other women doing other things. And we don't want women to drop out of the trades or to drop out of other, jobs where they can't work from home. You can't be a plumber and work from home, and you can't be a truck driver and work from home. And we want women to be able to fully participate in all those economic sectors. So we're going to have to come up with solutions.
And one follow-up to that, and then I'll take a couple more questions from the Q&A. We have about 4 minutes. The time has just flown by. So, the conundrum of this issue of women in caretaking, women in work, women and kids, is that in some ways it's a perennial, and it feels at times insurmountable. But my grandmother used to have this expression, how do you eat an elephant, kind of one piece at a time. Everyone's grandmother has probably told them that as a way to encourage people to tackle big problems. And I guess my follow-up question to you is, in terms of kind of the gender dynamic in the home, there are some proven strategies that begin to reduce those fissures. And one of them is obviously that the local mechanisms for redress, whether it's addressing domestic violence, or ensuring that there's paid parental leave, or ensuring that there are mechanisms in place for women to report sexual harassment or discrimination on the job, or failure to accommodate, that there are practices and laws that can help transform the way women are out in the world and the way that women are at home. And I didn't know if during this time of a pandemic, your office had kind of tweaked and rejiggered its focus to maybe look at some of the internal mechanisms that would be receiving complaints, or addressing more concretely the obstacles that women are facing in the home with gender norms.
So, we're trying to design interventions that can help address pretty specific, concrete problems. I think for us, one of the challenges that we have, for instance, when we're working on the enabling environment for trying to promote women entrepreneurs and women's economic participation, we see that, I'm a lawyer by training, so I like to focus on the legal and regulatory laws and regulations that are keeping women from being able to participate, whether it's not being able to own and inherit property on an equal basis, or having to have a male relative sign your form to get a passport, or to get an identification card, or to get a loan, or to do anything, to file court papers or incorporation papers. So those kinds of trying to work through those, what we would consider in our society low-hanging fruit barriers, they're low cost and high impact ways of affecting larger change in a society. And when you think about the law, that the law can be a leading indicator or a lagging indicator, right? And so we have to think about what, in those countries where the law is can effectively be the leading indicator, and a change in the law can help to change the societal norms by creating opportunities for women and giving them the chance to do things, and then show that they're fully capable of making a great contribution and helping to advance the society, whether it's through peace and prosperity or whatever mechanism, through political leadership, you name it. I think that in a very personal way, I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I see how, she's growing up here in the United States. She can do pretty much anything she wants to do. The future is hers. There's nothing really standing in her way except her own dreams and whatever she can come up with. But I look around the world and I see so many 11-year-old girls who don't have the opportunities and who don't. And I think that we should be working to try to make sure that everybody in the United States has the same opportunities that my 11-year-old daughter has, and that every 11-year-old girl around the world has the same opportunities. And so I think about it, I look at the world through her eyes a lot of times, but then I also am trying to figure out, how do I get as many, how many 11-year-olds out there can we open up the horizons for? So like I said, we're working at both that very micro level, individual women who we work with, whether it's through our Women of Courage awards or through our programs that are training programs. But we're also trying to affect at the macro level and really affect those structural changes that open up the space for everybody, and that make it possible for every little girl and every woman out there to be able to expand their participation, to own their own business if that's what they want to do, or to stay at home and be a mom if that's what they want to do. I think the validation of our choices and having those options and those opportunities is really what it's about for us. And to be, it shouldn't, there's no one way to be a woman in the world. I think we can all agree on that. And the key for us is to make sure that every woman has the opportunity to pursue her dreams and to fulfill her destiny in that way. So that's what we're trying to work towards.
A rousing cry for the end of the program, that women actually get to control their bodies and their lives forever. So thank you so much, Ambassador Currie, for this robust and timely discussion. It's really been our honor to have you join us here at Perry World House for this critical conversation. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us on this Tuesday afternoon, at least on the East Coast, and asking your probing questions. We hope to see you next week when we will be hosting retired Lieutenant General and former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster to discuss his new book, Battlegrounds: The Fight to Defend the Free World. More information and links to register are in the chat. As always, you can access a recording of this and previous conversations on our YouTube channel. You can find out all about our other upcoming events by joining our mailing list and following us on social media for up-to-date information on critical contemporary global affairs issues and policy issues. We'll drop links, if they haven't been dropped already, to those in the chat as well. And thank you all again for being here with us today. Until we see one another again, be well. And again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Ambassador Currie. Goodbye, everybody.